Okay, so tonight the Dharma talk is about the third precept, which the way it's translated on the MZMC site is not to misuse sexuality. By the way, my name is Alan, for those of you I haven't met yet. So just to give an outline of some of the stuff I wanted to bring in here, and this is really, I would say, a personal reflection on this precept in general, based on my experience, and none of it is my knowledge. I want to make that clear. I'm bringing in ideas and things, ideas that I've found helpful or useful as I think about this. So just to give you an outline, I wanted to start off with the overall context, or the container, if you like, for this precept. So talking a little bit about the Bodhisattva vows, the idea of ahimsa, and some of those kinds of things. And then talking about this idea of not misusing sexuality, or sometimes translated as sexual misconduct. First of all, on a gross level, so some of the more obvious manifestations of it. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the subtle aspects of it. So subtle aspects in relation to others, so our relationship to others, and then also some of the ideas or attitudes we may hold towards ourselves around this idea. So that's just an outline, bit of context, talk about it on a kind of fairly gross, obvious level, and then talk about it on a bit more of a subtle level in relationship to both others and ourselves. I guess that the first thing, when I think about the precepts in general, and my experience with them over the years, so the first thing that kind of comes to mind is the idea of ahimsa, so that word that is often translated as non-violence. But actually going beyond that, and we have our three pure precepts, the idea of ceasing from evil, doing only good, doing good for others. What really calls me, what inspires me, is this idea of the Bodhisattva. So beings are numberless, and we're vowing to save them. We're vowing to get to the bottom of all delusions, to enter any Dharma gate possible, and to somehow live the Buddha way. So when I think of sexuality through that lens, it seems to call on me to take as wide a view as possible, and to really make it personal and look at it in my own lived experience, how it shows up in my life and the world around me. And one of the interesting aspects of this is, as Zen practitioners and students, is we're all familiar with the Heart Sutra and this idea of form being emptiness and emptiness being form, and we often hear Tim talk about one bright pearl, Dogen's fascicle on that. Some notion of being called to embody, manifest the absolute in our practice. And yet we live in a world that is relative, right? Day to day, the fact that we're all here and talking to each other. So, we relate to each other through form. So just to name that, and that it's, for me, there's a very easy risk, and I've experienced this myself over the years, of spiritual bypassing, of using the absolute to somehow gloss over the aspects of myself or my experience or my attitudes that I'm less comfortable with. So in this relative world that we live in, we experience difference, we experience diversity, we experience pain. So I wanted to bring in a quote by an author. So some of you may have heard of, there's a teacher called Zenju Earthlyn Manuel. This is her book. It's called The Way of Tenderness. Actually, her Dharma name translates as I think it's Tenderness or Tender Heart. So she's a Black lesbian Dharma teacher. I just want to share a couple of words from her. So she just says here, and she's kind of talking about the idea of that, and right now with everything that's happening in our world, obviously with the pandemic, and then recent events in Minneapolis and around the world related to race and racism. So I just wanted to bring in what she talks about here. And I bring this in because, to me, questions of sexuality naturally relate to gender, which I can't personally separate from all of these other constructs. So here's what she says. Simply knowing race to be constructed or an illusion does nothing to change the mind saturated with hatred. To know that there are many ways to live sexually, with or without a prescribed gender, does not affect the extent to which one might be tortured or killed for doing so. Hatred remains potent whether directed at a construct, an illusion, or at the reality of others. So just wanted to anchor on that notion that really when we think about sexuality, it just how it relates to sexuality to me is expressed only in relationship, and so our relationship to others and the world around us, and then gender and all of these other things. The other thing I wanted to mention is out of Suzuki Roshi's statement. So this idea of practice enlightenment. So we practice and somehow we're already enlightened, and we enter practice from that perspective. And we're all perfect as we are, and we could use a little improvement. So wherever we're at on this journey with all of this stuff, just acknowledging that and acknowledging what might be possible. So that was just sort of some context, and then I wanted to move a little bit onto the more gross level when we think about sexual conduct or misuse of sexual energy. So there's some fairly obvious things, the seeking to avoid harm through our sexual behavior and our energy. So that's some fairly obvious things. Things like unwanted advances, consent, all of these issues come to mind. There's another good book that we're reading in our household, which is called, what's it called? Boys and Sex. And there's another book called Girls and Sex. But it's all about thinking about our attitudes and our relationships to some of this stuff. So, and consent is one of the big things this book talks about. So, and some obvious things, and these are spelled out in our ethics statements on the MZMC website. So that sexual relationships between teachers and students are proscribed or are prohibited. And I wanted to mention, in various spiritual sanghas over the years, there've been a number of sexual scandals and cases of sexual misconduct, of harm, and we have it in our own lineage unfortunately, with Katagiri Roshi. So, I speak for myself. I grew up in a Catholic environment with a lot of the stuff that comes with that, and had a real desire for perfection. So any teacher, any Dharma teacher I would have, or any lineage I would consider connecting with, had to be perfect. And one of the things I've been learning, and I'm still on this journey, is to acknowledge what's not acceptable, what's harmful, and also to acknowledge what's good in a lineage or in a tradition. So in our own tradition, of course, we have some of our history, and yet we have this sangha and this community that's kind of moved on. And as I heard a talk recently, I think it was by Norman Fisher, on this, how through some of these examples, there's been a lot of learning in the sangha. How do we negotiate this, and how do we see teachers as not somehow superhuman beings, but human and fallible, and create the right boundaries and parameters around conduct to make sure that we protect everyone. So that's some of the, on the gross level, some things I wanted to mention. You will often have heard the quote by Suzuki Roshi, a female student. Tim has told the story many times, went to him and said, I'm having feelings for you, and I'm feeling attracted to you, or whatever language he used around that. And his statement to her is that I have discipline enough for both of us. So he had enough of a sense of groundedness in his own practice to be able to be aware of that in her, and not be affected by it, and be able to hold that relationship skillfully. The other thing I wanted to mention, I know I'm pulling out a bunch of books here, it's nearly done, but I wanted to mention Tim's book, so Zen in the Age of Anxiety. If you haven't read it, there's an excellent chapter here on sex. I'm not gonna repeat it. I'm not going to try and repackage what's there, but it's really, really excellent stuff in that as well. So I wanted to move on then to think about some of the more subtle aspects of misuse of sexuality. So first of all, there's our relationship with others, and I guess attitudes towards other genders. So as a male, as a white male, being very aware of the privilege that accrues to me being a white male. And then also historically in Buddhist sanghas, the role of women has been, women's role has been minimized, the voice of women has been suppressed in many ways. And we had this great practice period recently, I think all of you were on it, where we studied the Zen women ancestors. The founder of our Soto Zen lineage, so Eihei Dogen from the 13th century. So in his book, his famous Shobogenzo, he has a chapter called, I'm going to pronounce this really badly, Raihai Tokuzu, which translates as something like finding the marrow through bowing. But this whole chapter, and I heard Brad Warner, some of you will be familiar with Brad Warner, describe this chapter as a rant, a feminist rant, because he goes on and on and on about the role of women and calls his monks pretty much like pig-headed and stupid if they're besmirching or minimizing or downgrading women's role in the Dharma and Buddhism. I'm just going to read you a real short paragraph here. He says, why are men special? Emptiness is emptiness. 4 great elements are 4 great elements. 5 skandhas are 5 skandhas. Women are just like that. Both men and women attain the way. You should honor attainment of the way. Do not discriminate between men and women. This is the most wondrous principle of the Buddha way. And he's a bunch of other stuff in there about if you're appointing an abbot, like don't pick the dummy just because he's a guy. If there's a woman in your sangha, whoever's in your sangha who he calls it a clear eye, that's the person you want to have lead your sangha. Some other things to bring in. There's this concept of the male gaze. So one of the things I'm aware of is, and I have a kind of growing awareness of and been learning about, is this notion of how is sexuality and our attractiveness valued in society. So the male gaze was coined by this film critic, Laura Mulvey, and it's really just talking about this idea of objectifying and valuing somebody based on their appearance. So, that the sexualization of somebody and connecting that to value or worth. And one of the things she talks about, there's this idea of body shame and how in studies that if a woman knows she's going to be viewed by a man versus a woman, the way she experiences that and the way she experiences herself and her view of her own body is vastly different. So, how that shows up for me is just, I'm familiar with some sanghas that they'll talk about custody of the gaze. And, I guess how I interpret it from a Zen perspective is, are we seeing the whole person? Are we seeing a person beyond their gender, beyond their physical manifestation? Are we being mindful of how what's showing up for us as we interact with others and how we view others? The other thing I wanted to mention is there's a great documentary. It's on YouTube, so you can watch it for free. It's about an hour and 15 minutes. It's called The Feminist on Cell Block Y. It's so there's a guy who was incarcerated, and there's a whole other. I won't go down this rabbit hole. But there's a whole other history and notion around incarceration and how that shows up, particularly in the US. So, young black man incarcerated. He'd committed a robbery to basically earn money for rent, and the reason he did it, and he talks about it in this documentary, is because he felt as a young man. And he had a partner, he had a girlfriend who actually, he could have lent him money to pay rent. But he'd inherited this idea that for him to be a man, he had to provide for himself. And he was joined a gang when he was about 13 or 14 because that was the model of masculinity that he grew up with. And he was given a provisional sentence of 150 years. And through various things, there was a GoFundMe campaign, and they raised money, and he got a skillful lawyer, and he got a shorter sentence, and he's actually out now. He was released in 2018. But in this documentary, he wanted to bring the idea of toxic masculinity into prison, and started talking about patriarchy with gang members. So, one of the things he talks about, the very first session they had, that he was laughed out of the room by these, very macho, conditioned men who were living this particular life. So one of the things he developed this program, and it's evolved over the years, and it's now been rolled out across a number of prisons and re-entry programs and that kind of thing. But what they talk about in this program is this idea of patriarchy and how often, particularly for men, when they hear that word, patriarchy is perceived as something specifically or inherently to do with being against masculinity somehow. And he unpacks it in a way where he talks about this idea of toxic masculinity And he talks about how, as in the community he grew up in, and most of the folks that he works with who are incarcerated, there's three things that they grew up learning about what it means to be masculine. So one is to be violent. So violence is one of the first ways in which you would learn to cope. The second was objectification of women. So perceiving women as purely as objects for sexual gratification and conquest. And the third thing he brings in is this idea of the pursuit of money. So those three, violence, objectification of women, and pursuit of money, comprise this idea of toxic masculinity. And so part of what they talk about in this program is how can they as men reclaim that narrative, change that narrative to something else, because what unfolds in this is they realize they all were victims of these ideas. They didn't choose to work, to live or act this way, but they grew up in a culture, in a society, in an environment where this was the normal. So I wanted to share with you one other quote, which is from Bell Hooks. So she's an author, professor, a feminist and social activist. And when she talks about this, she says that the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, it demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. And if an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. So, one of the things I personally took from this is, growing up again as a white male, so some of the things I inherited about what it means to be male and to be masculine. And, part of my own experience, and as a heterosexual male, in my 20s, I was much more comfortable going to gay nightclubs than heterosexual nightclubs, because in a heterosexual nightclub, and I grew up in Ireland, quite a strong chance somebody would just assault you for no reason and attack you. Whereas in a gay nightclub, it's totally different energy. So this idea of toxic masculinity, patriarchy, this notion of violence, all these other things. One of the things I found particularly liberating about it is to realize, actually, I can think about this, how it shows up in my own life, and then consider how I can change those narratives that I grew up with, and start to bring in other narratives that are more skillful, more helpful ways of relating to others. Just a couple of final things. Actually, a couple more things. Yeah, there's a spiritual teacher called John Wellwood. You'll often hear him reference him in relation to spiritual bypassing. And just in terms of sexuality and relationship, one of the things he talks about is this idea of the relationship as a spiritual crucible, and that every human that we seek intimacy with or relatedness with is a koan. And one of the things he says is there's no formula for getting along with a human being. No technique will achieve relatedness. I am impossible to get along with. So is each one of you. All our friends are impossible. The members of our families are impossible. How then shall we get along with them? And he really just talks about this koan of relationship as an invitation to enter into reality and to start to look at how we can suspend our agendas, the movies that we play in our minds, so we can really freshly see others, see them as the raw, he calls it the raw sacred other. So really an invitation to consider relationship as a realm of spiritual practice. So I just want to move on to the last couple of things about self-focus. So, how do we think about sexuality in relation to ourselves, and what are some narratives we have around that, maybe that we hold? Or another way of thinking about it is, what are some narratives that hold us, that we might be in the grip of? So one, I mentioned this already, we live in, and Tim talks about it in his book, we live in a hypersexualized culture. The US and most of the Western world was deeply puritanical for a long time. And now we have a culture where sexuality and attractiveness and those things are elevated to a level that they never were before. So just to notice that about our culture and how it prioritizes those kinds of things. The other thing I wanted to mention was, so in some spiritual traditions, and I practiced for some time in the Tibetan tradition, in that tradition, there's a notion of tantra, so tantric practice, where actually sexual energy is used as part of spiritual practice. And one of the funny things about this is it can often get misinterpreted. And some practitioners in this tradition, they'll actually engage in part of their practice will be intimacy with the partner, and they'll be using practices around that. But what I wanted to mention about that is that's obviously rife for abuse. And there are all sorts of folks who might claim to be tantric practitioners and will use this as a way to basically manipulate others. So one of the things I've heard the Dalai Lama say about this is that if a teacher, it's not so much relevant for our tradition, but just in general, if a teacher is talking about being beyond attachment and the temptations of self-gratification and saying that they can actually enter tantric practice with a consort, what he says is, a good test of this is, can this person eat a piece of excrement? So can they eat a piece of shit with the same equanimity that they would eat a piece of food? And if they can do that, then they've passed the test to enter this kind of tantric practice as teachers. And then he was asked, which Tibetan teachers were of a sufficiently high level of attainment and self-realization to do this, and he replied, 0. So, just wanting to bring in this idea that in certain lineages and traditions, there's a notion of actually practicing with this energy, but doing it in the way that it's sometimes interpreted requires a huge degree of spiritual maturity, and I think even the Dalai Lama himself would claim he's not there yet. So, a couple of other things I wanted to mention around this are because of the culture we live in and how sex and sexuality it saturates our media, and whether some of us may be in intimate relationships, some of us may not be, and there can be questions around. The question may come up: well, what does it mean to be sexually active with others or not? And you just bring in this idea of intimacy. So there's an Irish philosopher called John Moriarty. He's written a number of books. One of the things he talks about in an interview, and this is on YouTube as well if you're interested, in his early years, and he was a professor, and I think it was one of the universities in Canada. He talks about being in the marketplace. He was single, he was in relationships, that kind of thing. At some point he moved to the countryside in Ireland, and he was just talking about the fact that he hasn't been sexually active for some time. And what he talks about is this idea of he was living a very sensuous life. He spent a lot of time in nature. He was living in a rural area, spending time in the mountains, spending time just being immersed in that environment. And so what he says is, because he was living such a sensuous life, and a sensuousness in the sense of his physical senses and being immersed in nature, that physical togetherness with another human was less important for him. And he just calls out that he says this was a wonderful discovery for me, that he tapped into some sensuousness in his being that he wasn't even aware he had access to. And he was able to step into that more fully. I guess just the last thing I'll say about this is, my own experience. One of my first teacher, so Pancho Notre Rinpoche, who I studied for a number of years, grew up as a monk, so grew up as a Tibetan monk, entered a monastery at a very young age, and lived a life of celibacy. And for many years, I considered ordaining as a monk in that lineage. And, one of the things I struggled with was taking a vow of celibacy. Not so much on the celibacy part, although I knew that would be challenging, but more because I wanted to be a parent at some point. I had that sense, but also I struggled to understand how I would relate in the world with others, living that kind of life. My teacher, one of the things I noticed about him and others I met who lived that life was he had just a huge amount of energy. Whenever I hear stories of Suzuki Roshi being described, if you're ever around any of these long-term practitioners, I saw the same kind of energy in my teacher. So although he lived a life of celibacy, there was some huge amount of dynamism and aliveness. I guess I bring this in because it made me aware that my views on sexuality, on being sexually active or not, that there was other possibilities around this. It's kind of relating to that John Moriarty quote that it's possible to live fully and be fully awake and not necessarily be sexually active. So for me, that was a really helpful perspective to experience and to talk about. One of the things I explored with him ultimately was, I've got a choice here, two lifelong commitments I can make. One is a lifelong commitment of being a celibate monk, because it's a lifelong ordination you take, and the other lifelong commitment is being a parent. And we talk about that a lot and realized, and both were long-term commitments. And ultimately, the choice I made was to be a parent. Although thankfully, in our Soto Zen lineage, it's possible to ordain and as a priest and be in the world and have a family. I guess I'll just finish up with really, when I think about all of this misuse of sexuality, for me, it really comes down to intimacy. Being intimate with myself and my own attitudes around this, and then intimacy with others, and what does that look like, and how am I relating to others? Am I objectifying others? Am I seeing others as, regardless of sexuality, as is it a transactional relationship where I'm looking to, what can I get from this, or more around how can I truly be in relationship and conversation with another?